Yo, what's up? Dr. Swole here, MD bodybuilder, back with another episode on Swole Radio. Today I'm joined again by Dr. Eric Helms, who's infamous on this podcast now. And you all know that I have a soft spot for this guy. He's a pillar in our field and now a new federation record holder.
That's right. Thank you for having me back on. And yes, I am I don't like to brag, but I just, it's rare that you get to be the 2021 Helms Garage Nationals champ in every weight category, age, sex division that they have, which was only one, and that was the 93.7 kilo class. Insane. So I want to thank my mom, God. Couldn't have done it without the team, all the standard tropes. So it was good times.
Yeah, awesome to see. And today we're going to be talking about the last sort of segment in our staircase of training priorities, and that is going to be intensity and rep ranges. So we're going to touch on intensity, relative intensity, including failure training, and then go on to talk about rep ranges, all for hypertrophy. So everyone trying to maximize those gains. So yeah, just starting off, I was thinking we could just briefly touch on sort of your current thoughts on optimal training intensities and relative intensity for hypertrophy training specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what has been pretty well established in the last, well, really, if you look at the research, like decades, but I think what's become translated into practice and understood in the trenches, in addition to being collated and generally become the consensus in research, is that there's a pretty broad range of loading zones we can use. There's the idea of there being a hypertrophy RM zone that's traditionally, 6 to 12, 8 to 12, 6 to 15, somewhere in there, is really more of a practical zone rather than the required zone, or where, it optimizes hypertrophy for some reason directly related to the number of reps. What it really comes down to is, does the set last long enough and provide sufficient stimulus during it? So we've pretty well established that if you're doing at least 5 or 6 reps and the set is hard, and it's not really, 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 really high rep, each individual set will be on equal footing in terms of global outcomes in hypertrophy. There's more nuance than that, but what that effectively means is that you can prescribe anywhere from, say, 6 to 30 reps for any given set. And my general thoughts on, well, which relative intensity should I use? Should I be using 40% of 1RM, or should I be using 85% of 1RM? Should I be doing 6, or should I be doing the 30 rep set? I think that very much comes down to, what are you adapted to? What exercise are we talking about? And then how does it interact with other variables like proximity to failure, total volume, exercise order, and things like that. So a couple things to consider. It probably makes sense to not train in just a really narrow rep range. Right now, we have some, I would say, conflicting, but overall leaning towards the concept that being in a narrow rep range is probably inferior, at least long-term, for hypertrophy. So there's been many proposals for why you wouldn't just want to train 8 to 12, but maybe you do some 6s and here, so maybe you do some 20s. The most often thing cited kind of in the bodybuilding world is the idea of getting different hypertrophy in type 1 or type 2 fibers. So fast for slow twitch, preferential hypertrophy. This is shown very inconsistently, and if it is an outcome, it's pretty minor. The only studies where I've seen it occur with pretty convincing, consistency, as well as to a large magnitude, is taking powerlifters and then throwing them into high rep BFR training, middle of the block, something they're very unaccustomed to. So I think the average bodybuilder is probably not going to get a whole lot out of doing a low load versus a high load training cycle with vastly different rep ranges in terms of actual preferential type 1 or type 2 fiber growth. But it may do a little something. And we have the proof of concept that if you're a power lifter, for example, and you've been training very, very specifically for your sport, you might have, some gaps that could be filled. So that's typically not your average bodybuilder unless you had a very, very dogmatic approach to training on one end of the spectrum prior to some point. Some other lines of mechanistic research that, some don't show this, but there's a fair amount that do, that when you use low load training versus high load training, some of the actual anabolic signaling pathways are a little bit different. So even though we might see similar hypertrophy in volume equated studies longitudinally, acutely, they may occur via slightly different pathways. So it would make logical sense to try to get some maybe arguably complementary, different loading zones. And then finally, there's a practical argument. If you always train in that, say, like 5 to 10 loading zone, you like lifting heavy, that's great. It encourages progressive overload. You'll be able to gauge proximity to failure better because you're starting closer to failure when you can only do 5 or 6 or 10 reps. Mm-hmm. So that kind of takes care of the effort side of the equation. However, you're also going to see increased, forces through your joints and loading, and maybe higher injury rates. I don't mean that to be alarmist. The injury rates are still like lower than something like basketball. But when we look at the injury rates in bodybuilding and compare them to strength sport, bodybuilding typically has lower injury rates. So if you take a very like heavy load training approach for a long time, you might be worth deloading that for practical reasons to give yourself, a break on the joints. However, on the other side of the equation, there we have data where you compare people doing like sets of 20 or 30 to sets of like 6 to 8. And depending on the exercise, of course, and of course, depending on proximity to failure, those higher rep sets typically elicit less enjoyment and higher sessional RPE. So the puke factor, that's why they call them widowmakers, right? Doing 20 rep sets of squats.
Such a prejudice against high rep sets.
Exactly. So, maybe that's the strength athlete in me speaking, but, no, obviously, like if you told me to do a high rep set of lateral raises, that's very different than doing a high rep set of like hack squats or something. Oh, yeah. Like so anyway, we have like basically converging lines of evidence, very, very small effect for preferential fiber type hypertrophy, different signaling mechanisms, different experiences, and then different types and amounts of fatigue per set that would all suggest, hey, it's not a bad idea to train across the spectrum of loading ranges for the quote unquote hypertrophy zone, which we've now discovered is way bigger than 8 to 12, but more like, 6 to 30 or 6 to 40.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good treatment of the topic. And I think that there are a few kind of factors to weigh in on either side, which you've covered very well. Actually, coming back to the fiber type thing, I know we brought up at one point, we've talked about this before, about how, like different muscle groups and different exercises can respond better to different rep ranges. How much do you think that the fiber type plays in terms of, say, loading specific muscle groups? And how would people know for their own composition?
Yeah, I don't think it actually plays a huge role. And there's a lot of muscles in the body which are very mixed. And even if you are an outlier, first, you really have no way to really like definitively assess that. The closest thing we have are like AMRAPs at 80% of 1RM. And if you get high reps, you're probably more slow twitch if you get low reps. But there's a very high variability in those types of tests. I wouldn't consider them scientifically valid. If you just came off of a high rep training block or a low rep training block, you would think you were one or the other. It would influence the noisiness of that. So it's not a very reliable test. I'm not suggesting people get biopsies, because then even if you do, the question is, well, what do I do about it? Like some really old school kind of what I would argue are illogical approaches. Well, hey, if you are slow twitch, therefore you should do a lot of high rep training and volume and higher reps. And that doesn't really like make any sense to me. Like that would mean that endurance training would be the ultimate training for someone who's more slow twitch. And that's not true. It just means you're going to be good at it. I think the best way to think of it is that for power and in muscular endurance, your fiber type can influence the ceiling of your adaptations. But if you want to be a bodybuilder, regardless of your initial genetics, you're going to want to train for hypertrophy, and in a pretty similar way to everyone else. You will need to train with a sufficient level of effort. You might find you can do more reps at a given relative load than others on certain muscle groups or for maybe most exercises, but you're still going to need to put in that work. Some differences you might find, however, are that there is some preliminary data that people who are more slow or fast twitch dominant in their fiber composition seems to have different experiences of how much muscle damage they incur and how long fatigue lasts. I don't think it is the largest component to that. And I don't think it's something you can necessarily know or infer. You can't work backwards and be like, oh, I take a long time to recover, therefore, I'm fast twitch or something like that. And ultimately, you make a decision based on the outcome. If you find moderately high volume, close to failure, makes you sore for multiple days, and it precludes you from doing a very high frequency training program, then don't do that. But you don't have to worry about whether that's because of your fiber type or not. It's one of those things where you just simply kind of respond to that reality and then set up an individualized program based on that. And as a throwback to when we talked about frequency, I think there's a study out now that, or actually it might be 2019, but anyway, it's a study I didn't discuss in our podcast on that, where they used a within subject design. So meaning that one leg of the same person was randomized to two different protocols, one being a high frequency protocol, one being a low frequency protocol. And when you looked at the overall group level outcomes, there was no significant difference in hypertrophy between the groups for lower or higher frequency when volume was equated. However, there was a high degree of within individual variance, meaning that at the group level, it doesn't make a difference, but you, N of one, dear listener, might respond better to a higher or lower frequency. So that is just one of those examples where something that isn't a big key player when we make broad recommendations out to everybody doesn't mean that it might not make a big difference for you individually. So, and that could be related to fiber type, difficult to say.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, it also sparks something up for remembering kind of, I think you mentioned this at one point on some podcasts where talking about how often bodybuilders who get very, very sore and take a lot of damage from relatively low volumes, those people often tend to do well.
Yeah.
I wonder if that has any relation, to the
probably. I wouldn't be surprised if those people weren't more often on the high proportion of fast twitch fiber spectrum. Wouldn't surprise me.
Do you have any general guidelines of how people should sort of split up their rep ranges? I know that in the pyramids, you talk about having kind of a majority in your intermediate sort of rep range, and then having some a smaller amount in other rep ranges.
Absolutely. So I think to follow up from some of that kind of broad convergence of evidence and lines of research of why you might want to consider more rep ranges, the real proof is in the pudding when we look at some of the training studies. And none of them are super, super convincing, but we basically have like a handful of studies where they compare volume equated groups doing different rep ranges either within week or week to week or in multiple mesocycles. And there's a number where they've compared, say, one group versus the other, and there was no significant difference, but the findings lean in terms of effect sizes and percent changes towards the group having a little more variety. So the overall picture of this is you could either, have a whole mesocycle devoted to, a given rep range, say like, I mentioned earlier, 5 to 10, or say, 8 to 15 or 10 to 20 or something like that. Or you can have them diversified within the same session or within the same week. And there's data to suggest that wouldn't make a huge difference. There's no reason to think it would. It's not like this is going to interfere with each other or anything like that. So generally the way I recommend to do it, like you mentioned in the pyramid books, is I recommend roughly half to 2/3 of your volume in most cases should be in that kind of intermediate loading zone. And then, so let's say, 8 to 12. And then the remaining, let's say if you got 50% there, the remaining 25% would be heavier training, and the final 25% would be lighter training. And that's a good breakdown. The 8 to 12 rep range, or the 6 to 15, just kind of that kind of intermediate range, is a good choice for just a lot of exercises. It's typically not too high rep for compounds where you're tapping out due to cardiometabolic fatigue. And it's typically not too heavy for some single joint movements to where, tendonitis rears its head or it's just uncomfortable. So that said, there are certain movements which really lend themselves to certain rep ranges. So one of the things that I typically do is I think of what's the appropriate rep range and proximity to failure for a given movement. So for example, for free weight compound exercises for the lower body, I typically restrict it to like a 2 to 4 RIR in most cases. So they're not going all the way to failure. Mm-hmm. And again, that's someone who can actually accurately gauge it. And then I typically like to keep it like 10 reps or lower, because if not, I find that it's just too fatiguing and it messes with the quality of the rest of the session. And that's not to say we can't get some 12s and 15s and even 20s in our leg training program, but reserve that for something like a leg press in the slightly higher rep ranges, and then a leg extension, for example, when you're getting to the substantially higher rep ranges. That's the type of perspective I take. And I think you can still then combine that perspective with an overall block that is higher or lower rep. So let's say you were in a low rep block, but you had, say, a deadlift, a leg press, and a leg extension in the same session on your leg day. So in the low rep block, you might be doing 3 to 5 reps on deadlift. That's kind of something where you're doing your heavy training. Then on that leg press, you're training in the 6 to 8 rep range. And then on the leg extension, you're in 8 to 12. If you're to do a high rep block, you just shift them all up one. So it becomes, it goes from 3 to 5 to 6 to 8. And then it goes from, 6 to 10 to 8 to 12 on the leg press. And then the leg extension becomes like 12 to 20 or something like that. And you can kind of alternate between those approaches to give your joints a break, different stimulus, change out exercises, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I really like that. Yeah, approach. And I have a very similar kind of recommendation for rep ranges for people. I usually say 2/3 in around the 6 to 12 rep range, and then 1/3 outside of that rep range, and then kind of tailoring that by muscle group. So like for some people, like for myself, for example, for the chest, I really like the lower rep ranges. So that extra 1/3 would more so be in the low reps. And then say for side delts, that extra 1/3 would all sort of be in the higher, 12 to 20 rep range kind of thing. But yeah, like I also, this has been something I've been wondering about, your thoughts on just periodizing rep ranges across mesocycles. It sounds like from what you're saying is that you could do it either way, like you could either kind of have a more conjugate method where you kind of have that mix in there all the time, or you could make it change over larger time scales.
Absolutely. Yeah. And for those who are interested, there was a recently published position stand led by Schoenfeld and colleagues. I am one of those colleagues, where it's on our basically consensus statements on hypertrophy training to maximize muscle mass in athletes. It's open access. If you kind of Google that, if you Google like Schoenfeld, Helms, Steele, and a few of the other authors, you'll find it. And the very last section is periodization, and I was my assignment to write that section. And so the interesting thing is you can periodize your hypertrophy training, and I probably would recommend that you do, even with some loose tenets of periodization, but you technically probably wouldn't have to, and you could still get kind of quote unquote optimal results based on the data we have, and actually based on what we see in the trenches, because not all bodybuilders obviously periodize their training. So one approach, like I mentioned, and there was a semi-recent study that showed, alternating, like they had a 3-week lead-in period of hypertrophy training, and then they had a strength block, then a hypertrophy block that outperformed a group that just kept their hypertrophy training the whole time. I also mentioned there is a DUP approach that has been shown by Schoenfeld, and then another group, which I can't remember the last name on, that had slightly higher effect sizes. This is the same study that I was referencing earlier, in groups that on different days train in different rep ranges for all the exercises versus one group that kept it the same.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, there is a periodized versus non-periodized approach, kind of following Dr. Squat's old guidelines, Fred Hadfield's approach, to where you would try to train across the different rep ranges, either doing it for a full week or in every session. So the idea is that one group in this study was training every session with a different rep range, kind of like I described. So they go low reps on a compound movement that's free weight, moderate reps on a compound movement that was machine, and then high reps on another exercise, an isolation exercise. And then the other group would just stick the same exercises with the same number of sets, but in one rep range entirely on a week-to-week basis in like a periodized fashion. So like, light, medium, heavy type deal. Mm-hmm. And they found no significant differences between groups in terms of hypertrophy, and there was really no leaning either direction when you look at it. Now, technically, training in every rep range in the same session and not changing that over time, except for just simply trying to do more reps or increase the load, is not periodized. So the other group was following what we would call a weekly undulating periodization approach, right? So the rep ranges change on a weekly basis. Mm-hmm. The other studies I cited earlier in that, that would be a periodized group versus a non-periodized group. The non-periodized group always had the same rep ranges on every session. The other group was following a daily undulating periodized program. And then finally, that first study where it was like 3 mesocycles, hypertrophy, strength, hypertrophy, that would be a kind of a block-ish periodization style versus a non-periodized approach. What defines a non-periodized approach in the literature is when there's no variation in loading. And so essentially, if you're just pushing for progressive overload, but not changing the loading ranges, not changing the exercises, that's not periodized. And that doesn't necessarily seem to be an issue in that study where we compared WUP to training across the rep ranges in the single session. So I think it's important to point out that just because it's a good idea to train across multiple rep ranges doesn't necessarily mean that therefore you have to periodize your focus on those rep ranges. You could do that within each session. However, ultimately you will end up following a pseudo-periodized approach because you'll be doing things like deloads, right? So you might swap out exercises. I don't know anyone in the bodybuilding community who literally just does the same exercises all year round. So even if it's like, yeah, I choose, these staples and I train in these rep ranges for 5 months and I do a deload every 8 weeks. And then I swap out 1 or 2 of my ISOs and swap one of my compounds and then train slightly lighter or slightly heavier. That is still periodized, in some manner. So I think ultimately there's no escaping at least some aspects of periodization, even if you take that approach where you're just focusing on training hard across the spectrum, across different exercises. But I do think that's a perfectly valid way of training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's cool to hear about the periodization research. I love kind of thinking about this kind of stuff. It's like my favorite kind of topic. But yeah, I can definitely see I kind of follow a sort of mixed approach where I really like the idea of having a mix of rep ranges across the workout, more so for practical reasons, where I find that at the beginning of the workout, when you have that intention, you have that sort of mental freshness. It's nice to be able to hit some heavier weight. And then later on, when you're kind of more mentally fatigued, it's a little bit less daunting to approach a lightweight for high reps.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I have kind of experimented with all those styles. And I guess the one kind of downside I've seen with more like a regimented periodized form, where say if you were doing a DUP where one day would be like light day, the other day heavy day, and on the light day, say you were exclusively doing high reps, I always find that kind of that metabolic sort of component builds up throughout the workout, and I find kind of my performance dropping a lot if I say did all sets of 20. But yeah, I think that they all kind of can have their applications. And I usually tell people that it's kind of for beginners, like less periodization is really necessary, and you can get a lot done in bodybuilding just by having a fairly consistent type of routine that doesn't vary too much. Even, as you mentioned, just by virtue of changing exercises and incorporating deloads, you'll have some form of periodization in place. And I think that at an advanced level, when people start finding, their growth stalling and slowing down, then it's worthwhile starting to think about the more advanced styles of periodization. So I was hoping we could switch gears and talk a little bit about proximity to failure for bodybuilding training. So for everyone out there, I know that Eric just put out a podcast on iron culture talking about failure training. So make sure you all go check that out. But we're just going to go over briefly some of the concepts here and maybe poke around on a few specific questions. So in terms of just starting off this discussion, I think a good first point would be how do you usually define failure?
Great question. So in the literature, and depending on who you're talking to, it's typically defined like two different ways. There's what we would describe as voluntary failure, which is doing the last rep you think you can do, and then stopping there, which is what most people think of as failure. And then there is what's called momentary muscular failure, and which is where you actually attempt the repetition that you don't think you can do and you fail, so that you actually observe failure. And that's really the only like objective way to say you reached failure, is to actually fail on a rep. Definitely not something you want to do like on squats alone in the gym without a safety rack.
Oh man, I used to do that like when I was a beginner. I had this
just
like
miss reps. I have
this terrible, OG bench setup with like this old barbell from my dad. It was in our like basement. And I'd set up these chemistry textbooks on either side to like catch the weight, and I would literally bench to failure every set and just like awkwardly try and place it down.
Yeah, dude, when I first started, I always thought if I didn't have my training partner with me, I would be able to make as good of gains, because I always did as many reps as I could do and then one or two more assisted on pretty much everything. So we would just have this like post-failure approach.
Nice.
And just for whatever information I was exposed to at that time in 2004, I thought that was like the norm, So it's funny how different perspectives you get over time and how the winds shift. But so I think the most common way of defining failure is doing the last rep you can actually do to the technical standards in the lift. And what that means is that everyone's going to have a different true proximity to failure when they get there, based on their ability to gauge, was that really the last rep I could have done? And the way we typically prescribe, record, or talk about proximity to failure is with what's called repetitions in reserve, or sometimes RPE, which is just kind of the inverse. So a 10 out of 10 RPE is 0 repetitions in reserve, 0 repetitions in reserve, meaning I couldn't have done any more. That's reaching voluntary failure. If you try to do the rep after that and you get a rep, it just means you're not good at rating RPE or RIR. If you then try to attempt that next rep and you fail during it, you mean you did a good job of rating that RIR 0, and that rep was momentary muscular failure, while the previous rep was voluntary failure or a 10 RPE, depending on how you want to define it. So that's what we're talking about. And to tie it in with rep ranges, the interesting thing is that basically it's like seeing the light of an end at the end of a tunnel. The light becomes brighter and you're more able to distinguish it the closer you are to it. And the same thing is true of your ability to gauge failure. So when we have done studies where we take someone and have them do as many reps as they can to an actual 10 RPE on squats with, say, 70% of 1RM, there's a high variability in how many reps people can do. Some people can do on the extreme end like 6 to 8 reps, and on the other extreme end more than 20. For the people who are doing more than 20 reps on that set, their ability to gauge RIR at, say, like 5 RIR or 3 RIR is far less accurate than those who are only going to be doing 6 to 8 reps in that set. So basically, the heavier the load, or rather, better said, more specifically said, the fewer reps in a set, the easier it is to gauge RIR. So for example, we have data on the squat, bench, and deadlift in trained males doing the 80% of one rep max, not 70%, so far fewer reps. And they had almost perfect accuracy in gauging how close to failure they were. So if you take trained individuals and you're doing not high rep sets, you can gauge failure better. And this tells us something about, okay, well, what about those high rep blocks where it's burning? I'm tired. Like you said, I did multiple sets before that and my performance is starting to drop. Motivation becomes problematic. Overall cardiometabolic fatigue is mounting. It probably means that our accuracy on RIR isn't great during those blocks. Now, if you combine that with some limited data that suggests that when you are training with low loads for high repetitions, that getting close to failure is more important for stimulating hypertrophy on a per set basis than with lower loads, we can see a potential problem there where in a practical setting, those high rep blocks might end up being at a lower proximity to failure than we expected and that we intended. Now, the question is, does that matter? And many people in the bodybuilding community have this a priori belief that you have to be near to failure. And I don't dispute that, but I think the definition of near to failure is heavily influenced by just what they've been exposed to. Like I said, in my experience, when I first started, it was to failure. And then you only got credit for the reps that were past failure, where you needed someone else to help you complete the repetition to really get the most out of your program. And my assumption, my belief based on, I'm not even sure what I read at that time that made me believe that, was that I couldn't even get a full stimulus without a workout partner, right? However, the research that's coming out is actually in opposition to that. We have a meta-analysis by Davies and colleagues that suggests there's no significant difference between training to failure or not for hypertrophy when volume is equated. And if you look at studies that were published since, we see very mixed data. Some of that could be because different studies use different definitions of failure. Are they using a momentary or a voluntary definition? How are they actually gauging failure in their lab? And also, what is the training experience of the participants? And then what's the rep range they're training in? So it overall converges at the fact that close enough to failure is probably further from failure than we expected previously, or that our intuition would tell us. You probably could be at a 3 to 5 RIR for the majority of your training. That wouldn't be the end of the world unless you're doing like really high rep work all the time, which is why earlier I'm not concerned about doing, say, 6 to 8 reps at a 2 to 4 RIR in a squat or something like that, especially when you've got multiple sets and you have like press and leg extension afterwards and things like that. And there's a lot of limitations in this data. We don't have a lot of good research on synergists and multiple regions of the same muscle group. One of the things that is proposed and is backed up by some acute data on EMG is that the prime mover might be doing a good solid amount of work on something like a squat or a bench press, so your quadriceps or your pecs, even when you're well far from failure, but you don't really get a good effective stimulus on, like, say, the synergists and the other regions of that muscle until you're closer to failure. That's not been proven definitively, but that is certainly a possibility because we don't often measure the hypertrophy in those other muscle groups. So, how close to failure should you be? It's not a very specific answer. So some people are like, I like a 2 RIR. And I'm like, in what context? Why? When? For what exercises? I think if you're looking for an answer of should I be going to failure or not, you're asking the wrong question. If you're looking for a specific RIR to use on all exercises all the time, you're asking the wrong question. Really, I think we need to pair RIR with the rep range, the exercise, and the phase of training we're in, and think of it as a variable to be progressed. So for example, if we go back to that same model of training I talked about earlier, where you could be doing, WUP, DUP, a block model, or training everything in the same session, you wouldn't want to go to failure on those earlier exercises because, like you talked about, the same way of doing, high rep sets and generating a lot of fatigue, we know that going close to failure generates a lot of fatigue. So earlier in the session, you probably want to be focusing on being further from failure. And later in the session, you want to get a little closer when you don't have anything else to do for that muscle group. So if we now take, okay, we've got our 6 to 8 rep range on our squat or deadlift. We've got our 8 to 12 rep range on our leg press or hack squat afterwards. And then we've got our 12 to 20 rep range on our leg extension or leg curl, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can pair those rep ranges and exercises within an appropriate RIR. So we probably want to be at like 2 to 4 on that compound free weight, heavily fatiguing full body exercise where you can move a lot of load. And we can drop that down to say like a 1 to 3 RIR on the compound movement that is not free weights. And then finally, we can get down to say like a 0 to 2 RIR. So maybe we start only two reps from failure on our first set and we let fatigue accumulate and we actually do hit failure on our last set of that last exercise for that muscle group. And that way you've effectively stayed as close to failure as you can without compromising performance within session. And hopefully, depending on, again, your individual characteristics and what type of frequency and time course of recovery you best respond to, enables yourself to then come back sometime that week and get the rest of your volume for that muscle group. Because typically, most advanced lifters can't get all the volume they need in an effective manner within one session, as we've talked about previously. So that is kind of what ends up emerging from this data we have. We don't need to go to failure. If you were doing a very low volume program, you probably would want to go to failure to make sure that every bit of that volume is as effective as you can. And then it doesn't matter if there's a high, time course of recovery. If it takes 96 hours for you to fully recover, well, it's fine. You might only be training once per week per muscle group. No big deal. That's kind of like your typical quote unquote bro split that I don't think has to be bro sciencey. I think you can definitely set up a 1 times per week body part split that probably would be good up to a certain point in your career until you might need more volume. So like you said, keep it simple when you start. So anyway, that's kind of my long-winded answer to proximity to failure is you need to think about pairings with phase, exercise selection, and rep range.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way to think about it. And kind of the way I see it is that you kind of want to maximize like your area under the curve for each session and then also across your entire training week. And
Yes.
kind of what you said about ramping up the RIR like throughout your workout or lowering your RIR is like a good way of doing that, because early on you really want to hit those big compound movements but still get a lot of stimulus for them, but not destroy yourself for your later session and the rest of your session. And especially on if you structure it the way we talked about, where you have your lower rep stuff earlier and your higher rep more isolation work later on, those isolation exercises, it's less costly to go close to failure. Like on a lateral raise, taking something to failure is a lot much of a different story than like deadlifts or something.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of like people talk about the effective reps model, where they say that the like kind of sort of stimulus you get will increase as you get closer to failure. What are your thoughts on that? Like in the context of what you said about the research saying that there's not that much difference and when like whether we go to failure or not.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the effective reps model is a useful model to understand why we care about proximity to failure. But any version of that model that gives a very specific, well-defined proximity from failure, where it matters and how much it matters relative rep to rep, is overreaching beyond what we know. And actually, if it's, let's say, only the last 5 reps really stimulate hypertrophy, that's in direct opposition to data we have. People are stopping short of that. They're training to like a 4 to 6 RIR and getting similar growth to another group that is training close to failure. And we do have those studies. So yeah, I think Stephen Box, if I recall correctly, was it George Box? I'm misrecalling. We'll just say Dr. Box, the statistician. Great quote. All models are wrong, but some models are useful. So I think it's a useful model to understand that if you were totally sandbagging, your load is too low, there's no velocity slowdown for any of your repetitions during a set. Like this appears to be not even the beginnings of a grind, you're probably not doing much. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go to the other end of that spectrum and train all the way to failure. So I think, excuse me, a safe recommendation is that training in a 0 to 5 RIR, depending on phase, exercise, rep range, how many times you're training that week, is where you should be spending 99% of your time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of saying it. And yeah, actually coming back, we also talked about how when you get to the higher rep ranges, you want to be, a little bit more cognizant of coming closer to failure. That 0 to 5, would you say that also applies to like the high rep range, like sets of 20 to 30?
It probably does, but the issue is that when you think you're at a 5-hour RIR, when you're doing 30 reps, you're probably not. So your ability to gauge, like, man, just think about any time you've done high rep leg extensions. They start burning 12 reps in, almost regardless of the load, right? So if you're loading your 15 RM and you do your 12th rep, or if you're loading your 25 RM and you're doing your 12th rep, and both make you want to stop, that should tell you something about your ability to gauge failure there. So I think you probably want to train more like that 0 to 2 RIR on high rep sets, just because you don't want to accidentally be at a 5 to 10, which can really happen even in trained lifters, especially if they're not accustomed to high reps and if they're not accustomed to training to failure. So that's just something I think we have to face up to. That's why doing 20 rep sets on squats, I've talked about Widowmakers jokingly many times. They're hard kind of regardless of what you load. And those are never intended to go to failure. And they're still considered like, oh my God, So I think we just have to be cognizant of that. So you probably do want to train closer to failure when you're doing higher reps. And again, this is one of those reasons why you wouldn't just want to always train high rep, because it can be just that mentally fatiguing. And that physically fatiguing as well. All of that metabolic fatigue accumulates, and it can actually trigger some central fatigue mechanisms, which can reduce performance, which is probably what you were anecdotally observing in your own training. So yeah, we need to be cognizant of that. So if there are these kind of requirements, like when we shift towards one end of the loading range, we have to consider how that's going to affect, the long run. So, which is why you probably do want to periodize it if you're going to use a lot of high rep training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I also liked how you talked a bit about earlier about how, we don't know very much about kind of the synergists and how those come into play. And when you start getting closer to failure, you start just engaging, other muscles. And I think that for a beginner, or especially someone who doesn't have a lot of time in the gym, it can be like an efficient way to train. And like when we talk about failure training, I think a lot in the science-based sphere, we're kind of referring to people who are like quote unquote optimally optimize their training, like they have basically as much time as they want in the gym and that kind of stuff. But for a lot of people, they're only in the gym 2 or 3 times a week. And for those people, I usually do recommend that they have trained fairly close to failure and actually train to failure pretty regularly, just because it's a very efficient way of making sure that you get the most out of your sets.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a trade-off there where if you do a set of 10 to failure, or if you do a set of 8 with that, the set of 10 might elongate the relative amount of fatigue you get from that disproportionately, just doing 2 less reps. Like you did 80% of the work, but you might have added the full day of recovery if you were to take a whole session and do it like that. Now, if you're only training 3 times a week, non-issue, and that is a worthwhile return on investment. However, if it was hypothetically better for you to get in a whole extra session, but being short of failure, that's where the bodybuilder goes, yeah, I would do that. But the person interested in training, but who only has 3 days a week to train, goes, well, I can't do that. So it's not a matter of what's more optimal. It's a matter of what is the best way to optimize within the constraints of your training schedule. So I think that's a really astute thing you pointed out. And I actually, so in the most recent mass issue that's just coming out on the 1st of September, I did part 2 of a video series on the minimum effective training dose. So this is coming out just in, I think, 4 days or 5 days from when we're recording this. I'm not sure when this is going to get dropped, but anyway, it'll be the most recent mass issue for anyone who's a subscriber. In that video, I give video examples of the minimum effective training dose for a trained lifter who would actually hope to at least maintain or maybe even make very slow progress with hypertrophy, or one that actually should produce progress for the average trained person, but just not optimal progress, but with the least time investment. So like a time efficient training program, and then like a true MED, minimum effective dose. And the MED one is 2 25-minute workouts a week. That's it.
Nice.
And then the one that is time efficient, that actually I think would actually produce hypertrophy in most people, is 3 times a week, around 20 to 30 minutes per session. So we're talking about maybe being able to get all your training done in the week in an hour if you're in good shape, maybe an hour and 10, 15, 20 minutes if you need to take longer rest periods. And it's using things like drop sets, supersets, antagonist paired training, a few sets training to failure, and really focusing on like compound movements to get it done, because we have data to back all those things up. And I think people just, if you've been listening to a lot of scientific-based training protocols for physique athletes to optimize their training, and you're not necessarily a physique athlete trying to optimize their training, but just looking for the best information, we very rarely talk about what does it take in terms of the best return on investment to make pretty good gains. So you might be under the impression that you're spending at least 4 hours a week in the gym, on the low end. And in reality, you might be able to get 90% of it spending an hour a week in the gym for at least the first couple of years of your training career. So I think that is something that most people are just, maybe they're aware of it on paper if they're presented with all the data, because it's not new information, but they just haven't really thought about what is the true time investment for me to get, say, 6 to 8 sets per muscle group at a high intensity per week. It's really not much, especially if you let compounds take care of the synergists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, yeah, I'm glad that you guys kind of talked about the like more efficient ways of training, because I think that a lot of people will benefit from that, since people are within the constraints of their allotted time. To zoom in and get really academic here, I guess a common or like question that will come up in the advanced world is, with volume and intensity or proximity to failure, you have kind of a trade-off where as you train more close to failure, you are not able to complete as much productive volume. So let's say within sort of the zone that we're talking about, like 0 to 5 RIR, let's say theoretically someone were to spend most of their time in the less intense version of that, like 4 to 5 RIR, and do more volume compared to someone who is maybe staying in sort of like 1 to 2 RIR and doing less volume. What's your hot take on what would be optimal?
Yeah, it depends on how less and how more we're talking about. Like, there are certain ranges where I don't think it would make a difference to the average trainee, but it might be better for the individual, kind of going back to that same thing with the frequency thing. So for example, let's say you had someone doing 10 sets to failure for every muscle group in a week, and you had another person training primarily in the 3 to 5 RIR range and doing 20 sets in an actual 3 to 5 RIR. So they are like, if they had done 3 or 5 more reps, they would have hit failure. I don't think there would be a difference on average. Like if we ran a large multi-site training study on trained individuals, I don't think we'd see significant differences between groups. However, if we looked at any individual in that study and we made it a crossover so that they were exposed to both, I think we'd still not see significant differences between groups, but we'd see some individuals who grew much better in one situation than the other. So, and that's probably why we see, or at least one of the reasons why we see these very dogmatic camps in bodybuilding, because someone who finds that when they went from a high volume approach to a lower volume approach with very high, or I should say very low proximity to failure, being very near failure, they started making gains, they broke some plateaus, and they transformed their physiques, while someone else maybe saw the opposite. And like, this is an anecdote I've experienced directly for myself. So like, for example, Jeff Alberts typically trains with 6 to 10 sets per muscle group, and he takes all of the sets to like a 0 to 2 RIR for the most part. Back in 2000, I want to say the off season after 2011, it was either 2000 off season 2011 or off season 2010. I can't remember. I was living in Sacramento, so I was only a 45-minute drive away from him. So I went on an upper lower split with him, and I just drove to his house and we trained together. And I took most of my sets to failure, and we did like kind of a modified like heavy duty type approach, you know. And I actually saw decreases in size in my upper body while he was, you know, trucking along, making great gains. My lower body continued to respond. I think I hit like a lifetime RDL PR during that time period, and my legs were looking good. But I like, and Jeff would confirm this. It wasn't just all in my head. He was like, yeah, I don't think you should do this. Like, your loads are going down slowly. You've actually lost some size. So that's just one example where, you know, I personally find that when I'm doing 12 to 20 sets per muscle group in the upper body, that's the appropriate amount. And that's when I can maintain or see progress depending on, you know, what muscle group I'm focusing on at the time, nutrition stuff, you know, all the other variables. So yeah, I'm one of those people who doesn't respond well to low volume, at least from the waist up. And Jeff is not that. And if you give him any decent amount of volume, he gets pretty wrecked pretty quick, and it elongates his recovery time. So I think, yeah, like, it's very understandable that if we were to take science out of the equation, Jeff would still be a low volume proponent, and I would be like a moderate to high volume proponent. We'd be arguing on the internet. But instead, we are coaches in the same company who have a more diverse skill set to work with the wide variety of people who ask for our help, which is ultimately what we want to get to. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, like, that's exactly my kind of theory at this point, where I think that, you know, you can kind of look at volume and the proximity to failure as, you know, multiplying and creating this product of some component of stimulus. And I think that for different people, they will respond better to one end of the camp, you know, within kind of the limits that we're talking about, and the more, you know, reasonable ranges of that. But I just, you know,
also like one or more, one or the other more. And I think the reason why a very like close to failure type of training is so popular in bodybuilding is because we pray to the willpower god. You know, that's the one thing all bodybuilders have in common, and we know that's what it takes to get on stage. You know, we love things like Blood and Guts, the Black and White Animal Pack ads. We love stories of personal responsibility and pulling yourself up from your bootstraps and the grind. And don't get me wrong, like, those are, like, having grit is an incredibly important part of bodybuilding. So I think it's not surprising to me at all that training paradigms that require more of that and tap into it are, you know, inherently psychologically rewarding for people. And I don't say that as a knock and saying, like, see, your programs don't actually work that well, you just love them. No, I'm saying you probably wouldn't be able to put in the same level of consistency and high quality of work if you weren't training in a way that you liked. So, you know, the good news is maybe what you're doing is perfectly fine. Just take a look at it. Like, if you're really low volume, really high effort, maybe consider, you know, moderating it slightly. But I think anytime you don't enjoy your training, it sort of doesn't matter if it's not quote unquote evidence-based, because you're taking some of the juice out of it. So, you know, maybe you're still going to be on one side of the spectrum, but identify that there is a spectrum that is still within the range.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point as well, that, you know, you got to enjoy your training. And as this one short little medical plug for anyone out there who, you know, is one of the puker types, or the pukers as we used to call them when we ran track, I recommend against puking regularly. It's not good for your, you know, the mucosa of your throat, but, you know, very common thing in bodybuilding. Oh yeah, and one more question was that, you know, along the kind of lines of arguments for, you know, failure training. So yeah, one of the benefits we mentioned is that you can increase the efficiency of your training if someone is very short on time. But the other thing was kind of just having it there as a check of your RIR. What's your recommendation for that for beginners who are starting out and don't have a good sense of RIR?
Absolutely, something I do recommend. We're actually working on a paper right now that's talking about methodological reporting errors, consistency, and the best way to run training studies when you care about proximity to failure. And one of the things we recommend is anchoring what a zero RIR is, so that your participants are more likely to be there. So basically, you bring them into the lab before the study starts, you have them do the exercises they're going to be in your study, and you have them train to failure, and you go, right, so that rep was a zero RIR. And that was the last one you were able to do. The one after that, obviously, because we spotted you, that was failure. Mm-hmm. And that concept would, of course, apply in the trenches as well. And it's a brave new world, because Bill, when I first started, like I said, I had been training past failure for the first 6 months to maybe 8 months of my career. And then I tempered it a little bit, and I was only training to failure, but I wouldn't do free weight movements where I could get hurt, like squats or incline press, ever without a spotter. And now I regularly train without a spotter, because I don't need it. And I'm not, unless I'm attempting a new max, I'm too experienced, So that is not necessarily the experience of people coming into it. It blows my mind to this day that some people actually are coming into resistance training, and maybe the first actual training book or recommendation they read could be something that includes RIR or RPE. So if you start your training without actually knowing what a zero RIR is, you're probably always going to be short of it. You're more likely to underestimate it. So I do think it's important to probably, at some point, and maybe primarily using machines, just so for a safety factor and so you can hit everything, go through a failure training block. Use the very low end, or maybe even 80% of the low end of the volume recommendations, and take every set that you do for maybe a full 4 weeks to failure. And I think that would be a really good way to anchor what your RIRs are, so you're not out there going, yep, that was 8 RPE when it was actually a 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really sound practice. I think that just having some component at some point where, for me, I'll often recommend that even if people don't necessarily believe that much in failure training, that they include it at some point in their block. What easiest place to do would be in the last workout of your mesocycle. So like when you're about to deload the next week, taking some sets to failure and kind of getting that check.
Yep. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Like, I think if I don't want to misquote them, but I'm pretty sure Mike has mentioned from RP, Renaissance Periodization, Mike Israetel, that they have like a decreasing RIR approach, so like 3, 2, 1, 0. So like at the end of every mesocycle before the deload, they get to go to failure, and they can see like, oh shit, I thought I was at failure and I did another rep, So you get that exposure to kind of keep that sword sharp, if you will. I think that's many ways to get it done. It could be something you periodize in and out, or it could be something that you do intermittently, or so long as you have the skill, it doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the skills of bodybuilding. I think right. I feel like RIR is one of those kinds of skills that experienced bodybuilders are very proud of, along with eyeballing macros.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why we cut our chops.
So yeah, anyways, that was a really great discussion. And just wrapping up here on a fun question.
One thing I wanted to add, Bill, that I just remembered is where the tension curve is in relation to muscle length is something to consider as well. So in RDL, the hardest point is when the bar is the furthest from the fulcrum, and that is at the bottom, and that's a very long muscle length for your hamstrings. That's a great example of something that always makes you sore, right? Mm-hmm. Muscles that movements that do that. Another example is most squats and leg presses. If you're doing a full range of motion, the hardest portion at the bottom is when your quad is the most stretched. And there are many other examples like flies. when it is most difficult, when your arms are far out to the side. Those are exercises where even if you don't train to failure, they make you pretty sore. And those probably are going to produce more of a tension stimulus to some degree, even if you are reasonably far from failure, at least in the muscle group that is stretched. So for movements like that, I generally recommend stopping a little shorter of failure, or you can just really elongate it. Like, I wouldn't recommend doing 3 sets of RDLs to failure, because even if you were used to RDLs, you're probably going to be sore for multiple days. And if you're not used to RDLs, you're going to be sore for multiple weeks in some cases. So that's another just one minor thing to include in there. So consider exercise selection as well for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really interesting, actually. I think that there are a lot of facets to consider about these stretch movements that, like we wouldn't normally just think about when we're just starting out. But like considering the exercise selection in your RIR choice. So yeah, just wrapping up, I'll just take a question from Instagram, actually. Someone asked, where do you see yourself and the fitness industry in 5 years?
I don't think it's going to be that different in 5 years. For me, it'll have been my honor to have a number of my PhD students complete their studies, and I'll be actually collaborating with them as colleagues as they are working somewhere, which is pretty cool. I look forward to that. I really enjoy mentoring people. I'll be getting back on stage in 2023. So I'm really looking forward to that. And as far as the fitness industry, I think there's going to be more and more and more information. And I think people are going to have to get better and better at discerning what is high quality information versus what is not. I've noticed that when I first started, evidence-based information was primarily about simplifying things. Like, the approaches that I followed when I first started were needlessly complex. Like, you can't combine fats and carbs. You can't eat after 6. Here's a limited list of foods that are allowed. These foods do this thing that's bad. These foods do this thing that's bad. And I found myself having to complicate my life, eating 2 hours, making sure I had the right kind of carbohydrate post-training, but different carbohydrates at other time, thinking about my the insulin response at different times, whether I was even accurate or not. So worry about the GI of foods, all that stuff. So when I got exposed to evidence-based information, it greatly simplified my life. But I think now I've noticed there's a lot of people who feel that trying to keep up with the evidence-based information is complicating their lives. There's too much information, at least that's their perspective. And they don't have the skill set to be able to differentiate what are the big rocks from the medium rocks to the small rocks. So, I mean, that's something that I've been trying to focus on in my career. The whole concept of the pyramids is about identifying priorities. But I do think that if we want to get greater engagement in science, in the fitness community, more people are going to have to think in those terms instead of just, I got to keep up with the pace of social media, which is not going to slow down, and have content every day. And I need to make those big headlines. I got to make people think this is important. So I think we need to consider that to move forward in a healthy way where we're actually helping people.
Yeah, no, wow, interesting point. Yeah, like I think that the advent of social media has really complicated the information space, where a long time ago, the only way you could have gotten your ideas out was to actually have a publisher and actually have some sort of review process, where nowadays, anyone can put out a PDF online or start a podcast or post their ideas on the net. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it becomes a lot trickier for people who may not have the scientific background or experience to be able to sift through that information. And that being said, my dear listener, you have obviously, come off to a good start in finding this podcast and listening to Eric Helms. So with that, yeah, thanks so much for being on the show again, Eric. And I'll be linking your links in the description below.
Mm-hmm.